Today's video is going to be on writing two-column proofs, and we've kind of started getting into this prior about statements and reading reasons and drawing conclusions. We're going to put all of that together to write a proof, and we are trying to prove two triangles congruent. We spent a lot of time on what does it take to prove two triangles congruent, and we know that in order to prove two triangles congruent, we always need three pieces of information. And we've talked about all the different ways we can use those three pieces of information to prove two triangles congruent. We're going to use our given information to draw conclusions to get those three pieces. So when we start writing our proof, we start with our first piece of information, and our first piece of information is given that RT is going to be parallel to KC. When I'm given a piece of information, the only way I would know that is because it was given. If I wasn't given parallel lines, there's no way I could assume parallel lines from my diagram. I take that given information and I mark up my diagram. So I'm given those two pieces are parallel. Then we're going to draw a conclusion on that given information. So the fact that I know those lines are parallel, that's going to give me additional information. Because the lines are parallel, I'm going to know that some angles are congruent. I know that angle T and angle C are congruent to each other. And right now I'm just drawing conclusions. I also know that angle R and angle K are congruent. So that's the conclusion I'm drawing based on the given fact that my lines are parallel. Your reason is, how do I know that they are congruent? I know those angles are congruent because they are alternate interior angles. And we know that alternate interior angles of parallel lines are congruent. Make sure that your reason, your justification, is complete. In order for alternate interior angles to be congruent, I must have parallel lines. So make sure that you're talking about the angle relationship that you have and why that you know that they are congruent to each other. Every time you're given a piece of information, you're going to use that given until you have proven something congruent. You can't move on to the next given until you've shown something congruent. And we just did. We showed two sets of angles congruent. So we've used that given. We move on to the next. The next given that I have is that I is the midpoint of segment TC. So if I is the midpoint, we know that it's this segment TC. If I is the midpoint, I know that these two pieces are congruent. So my given information, again, I would not have known that that was the midpoint unless I was given that information. That's not something that I can see from the diagram. Based on that given, I can draw the conclusion that segment TI is congruent to segment IC. How do I know that? Because a midpoint divides a segment into two congruent segments. So we've run out of givens. In order to prove triangles congruent, I need three sets of corresponding congruent information. So we check what we have. I see that I have two sets of angles congruent, two more sets of angles, and a side. I do have three sets of corresponding congruent information, which means I have enough information to say that my triangle is congruent. That was my goal. My goal was to prove that triangle TIR is congruent to triangle CIK. And then your justification, how do you know that? When I look at the order of my pieces, not in the proof itself, not the order that I show that they were congruent, but the order that they appear on my diagram, we pick one of our ends. We don't want to pick the middle piece, we pick the end. We go to our next consecutive closest piece of information given. So I'm going to go from this angle to this angle. I wouldn't go this direction because I would be skipping a side and I would be skipping an angle. I'd be skipping two pieces of information here. All I do is skip a side to get to the next angle. So this is by the angle, angle, side postulate. Alright, so that's what our proof is all about, is taking our drawing conclusions, our given information, and showing, using three sets of corresponding congruent information, that my triangles are indeed congruent. So it's just putting together all those drawing conclusions till we get our triangles congruent. We do always label our steps so I know which statement is going with which reason. We start with our first given. We are given that AE is going to bisect angle CEP. And again, the only way I know that is it was given to me. That's not something I can just make up. You can't make up information. So we look at our diagram. Here's segment AE. It's bisecting angle CEP. So if this segment bisects, it's giving me these two congruent angles. So based on that given information, I'm going to draw the conclusion that angle CEA is congruent to angle PEA. How do I know that? Because an angle bisector divides an angle into two congruent angles. So we use the given, we showed something to be congruent. Only once I show something congruent can I move on to the next given. So the next given piece of information is that CE is congruent to PE. We like those kind of givens because I don't have to do anything about it. I have the information provided. All I have to do is mark up my diagram. Segment CE is congruent to segment PE. But this creates a new issue. In order to prove triangles congruent, I must have three sets of congruent pieces. So far, according to my proof and so far according to my diagram, I only have two sets of congruent pieces. I have segments congruent and I have angles congruent, which means we have to get our third piece from the diagram. And you want to be really careful here because there's not a lot of things that you can visually see from the diagram. You have to have justification. You always have to be able to back up your statements. In this particular diagram, there is something that I can see in the diagram that I can assume without justification, and that is our shared segment. We look at segment EA. Segment EA is a shared side between those two pieces. So I can say that segment EA is congruent to segment EA. And how do I know that? Because of the reflexive property. The reflexive property is that shared side piece. There's my third piece. Now that I have my third piece of congruent information, I can draw my final conclusion that triangle CAE is congruent to triangle PAE. We go back to our diagram, we look at the order of our pieces, we pick one of the ends, we don't start in the middle. This is a side, this is an angle, this is a side. So I know that those two triangles are congruent by this side angle side postulate. Remember, we look at the order that the pieces occur on the diagram, not the order in which they occur in the proof itself. And we always need those three pieces to prove triangles congruent. All right, we are done.